Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's very, very nice to be here on such an important topic. And as Haneen says, please do look at the call for papers for our conference on anthropology and education very carefully, because it promises to be a most fascinating event. But we're here today to talk about, if anything, even more pressing issues. I always think that in X number of years' time, when they look back at the history of the world, at this juncture, they'll say, well, didn't anybody object to this great catastrophe? Why didn't anybody say anything? What is it that meant that everything just carried on as before until finally the whole thing collapsed? And we badly need books like this that hopefully will survive whatever's going to happen to us. And so at least people can begin to have an idea of the people who did object and the responses to them, and really the ethnography of people who say, come on, let's do something about this. So we really are grateful in our author's debt that she has given us the opportunity to discuss this today. And equally, we welcome the reviewer, Professor Barr from the University of Exeter. There we are. That's quite enough from me. We will, except I should just say with many apologies that I'm going to have to drift off at 1:45 for an pressing engagement, which I can't delay. And so just carry on until 6 if I have to leave a little bit before, if the conversation is still going. There we are. And we'll have a very short break, just on the hour, before we start with the general discussion. Good. So now over to our author, who will talk about the book for about half an hour. Please go ahead.
Thank you, David. And I have to start my time that you've given to me with my thanks, because I'm really grateful to you and to the RAI for giving me this opportunity to share. But also, I really wanted to thank Stewart for reading the book. And I think you said you read it twice, so I was really impressed. And thanks for the review, and to Haneen for setting this all up. But I really also wanted to thank all the activists who I've worked with over the years, and for the work that they've been doing and persisting with in the face of all sorts of struggles, and also for helping me to get the research done. And in a way, I'm also grateful for this airtime for Friends of the Earth, because I think that what they're doing, or what they have been doing for many years, is really finally is gaining acknowledgement about how important their work is doing if we are going to make this world to remain livable for some of us, for most of us. And I think, like, before I actually sort of dive into speaking about the book and the research, I just want to share something that I learned from an activist who I met in 2003. We were at a meeting in Adana in Turkey, and this activist was getting very angry about the discourses around climate change at the time in Europe and in the US. This was so around 2003. And he was telling me, like, that these discourses of climate change are focusing very much on this indistinct, indeterminate future. And what we should be paying attention to is what's happening to people's lives today because of the increasing dependence on fossil fuels. And he used the example of the Niger Delta, where local communities have their agricultural land completely and sometimes irretrievably ruined by oil leaks, where the air is virtually unbreathable because of gas flaring, the violence that they have to, they suffer with the minute there's any resistance to their lands and lives being threatened. So his anger was at the issues about climate change should not be about sometime in the future, but sometime in the present. And of course, this is something that has been happening for a very long time. And the thing that I took away from working for a long time with Friends of the Earth myself was that there is no way that you can think that you're living or trying to live a sustainable life if that lifestyle that you're choosing to live is supported or enabled in some way by exploitation of either people or the environments that they depend on anywhere in the world, right? So basically the driving force of Friends of the Earth is this understanding of environmental justice. So what I want to talk about in this time that I'm so excited to have been given is I'd like to present Friends of the Earth and how it's described by the activists themselves, to give you a sense of what this organization and thing is. And then I'll briefly summarize the book. And in the meantime, I'm going to try and show some photos so that I won't really be talking to the photos, but you get a sense of the places I'm talking about, the people and how we met and how we moved around. And hopefully you get a little bit of a sense of how it felt about the things I'm describing. So I will try and do that. Let's see. Okay. Stewart, can you tell me if you can see it?
Yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, super. Okay, so so generally the book is an ethnography of global environmentalism becoming Friends of the Earth is an ethnography of what I understood it to be an activist who belongs to Friends of the Earth, and what is it like to try and live this environmentalist activist life, and how the groups that they belong to function organizationally. How does these organizations come to be experienced as entities which are enlivened and become entities in their own right, and in that way actually have effect in the world as groups. And Friends of the Earth is described on its website as the world's largest grassroots environmental federation. And currently there are 73 member groups, and these are spread around the world. One of the photos is actually a map of where the member groups are. And they also say that they have millions of supporters and members around the world. And something that's really important in that description is this word grassroots, and I'll come to it in a moment. So basically, Friends of the Earth was the first Friends of the Earth group was founded by an activist called David Brower in the United States in 1969, and he was then a member of a group called the Sierra Club, which was very established and very active, but it was mainly focused on nature protection. And he found that there was a great lack of attention to justice issues. So he left and set up Friends of the Earth specifically to look at environmental justice. And then a couple of years later, in 1971, there were 3 other already established environmentalist groups in France, Sweden, and UK. And they decided together to join and make this international federation. So it was founded as an international federation in 71. So in 2021, they celebrated their 50 years of continuous and solid activism. And let me just explain how Friends of the Earth, here's the map with where they are. This is from 2006, but it's actually more or less the same. There are a couple more groups, a few more groups have joined. And how does it work? So that structure of having groups from different countries has stayed the same. And how it works is that first, a group will set itself up to address issues locally and become some sort of activist group in their own sense in their own countries. And then when they're ready, or when they feel it's time to start working in more international context, then you apply to Friends of the Earth International to become a member. And what this means is that the groups are very different, and currently, in order to be a member, you have to be quite a large group, very established, and really have your own way of working already. And Friends of the Earth is very often contrasted with Greenpeace, because Greenpeace doesn't work like this. Greenpeace has its own central office and then sets up its different campaign offices in different countries. So, for example, I'm from Malta, and Greenpeace opened an office in Malta in the early 2000s to start a campaign. But then when the campaign finished, they closed the office. So Friends of the Earth is in the comparison that both activists and some scholars have made, Friends of the Earth is this decentralized grassroots federation, whereas Greenpeace is centralized. Right? And this idea of being a decentralized federation has been there from the beginning. And in interviews, David Brower talks about how they wanted the federation, the organization of the federation, to enact the justice that they were campaigning for. And at the beginning, what this meant was that actually there was no real organization. It was basically activists meeting up at campaigns, protests, and in the 70s and 80s, it was about acid rain and whaling mostly at the beginning, and nuclear energy. And they'd meet up at protests and say, okay, what are we going to do next? But then over the years, more and more groups wanted to join. And the activists themselves said, okay, actually, maybe now we need some sort of office or secretariat that will facilitate our meetings. And at first, because the activist groups didn't have any money, the secretariat was roving. It went from group to group, depending on who had the resources. But in around 92, I think, the Federation received funding from Oxfam Novid to actually run this secretariat, and it stopped roving and found a home, a permanent home in Amsterdam. And this becomes really important actually later. So I just wanted to give a sense of the different groups, right? So I say like this idea of grassroots and justice, and in the older documents, one of the mission statements of Friends of the Earth International was to support and defend cultural diversity. Nowadays, that has been removed, and what there is instead is to defend and protect human and people's rights. And people, there is a people. So this has shifted now to paying attention to different ways of construing persons and groups. But because of this focus on difference, you have groups which are, some of them are historically dedicated to nature conservation, like the Austrian group Global 2000, it was historically a nature protection group. But then you have groups like Friends of the Earth Philippines, which is, the name of the group is Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center, Kasama sa Kalikasan. And their work, they set themselves up to offer legal support to small community groups that were campaigning for human rights or environmental rights. And so this is just to give an idea that you have really like different ways of working. And that this different way of understanding what it means to be an activist, politics, what it means even to relate to the world, are the sorts of things that are important to the activist's idea of justice. Now, while I was doing my research, I had a colleague, Johan Rasanagam, who at the University of Aberdeen, where I was based, and I should thank Tim Ingold as well for being a great supervisor, but also Johan asked me, so this focus on making space for difference, like to what extent is difference actually like made space for? Is it not really just a rhetoric where you have the differences are subsumed to some sort of unitary logic so that Friends of the Earth can be communicated as this thing? And it was a really important question because in fact, until around 2002, this what had started happening in the Federation. When the Secretariat stopped moving and stayed at home in Amsterdam, things started becoming a little bit more northern focused. And in 2002, there was a turning point where Friends of the Earth Ecuador left the Federation. And the reason they gave was that the Secretariat and the Executive Committee of Friends of the Earth International were privileging too much northern interests and approaches to politics and activism. And this had really impacted really badly on their actual protests against transnational corporations. They had been affected really badly. So they left, and the other South American Friends of the Earth groups said, you know, we agree with this situation, with this description of the problem, and we are also going to leave. So this could have spelled the end of the Federation, because they couldn't have claimed that this was a worldwide federation if they lost all the South American groups. And in order to try and save it, the Executive Committee organized an extraordinary general meeting in Cartagena in 2003 in Colombia. And at this, it was a very intense meeting. I wasn't there, but my friends and colleagues told me it was really intense. 7 days, maybe even 10 days actually, of really addressing the problems head on. And what they came up with at the end was that they were going to embark on this epic thing called the strategic vision and planning process, which was planned to last 10 years, but then to carry on afterwards. And for example, the first 3 years was entirely dedicated to the different groups finding ways to communicate what was important about their understanding of the world, of nature, the environment, of politics, and then finding ways to communicate it to the other groups. So this whole process was aimed at generating mutual understanding, solidarity, and real proper equitable space for those differences, right? And it wasn't an easy process at all. I was at the photo of the meeting currently, the general meeting in Abuja in 2006. There was a very intense debate about democracy. And it got to a point where it seemed like there was just no resolution. These are two incompatible positions. But what really inspired me was that the activists worked creatively to find a way to make these apparently opposed positions like become complementary. And they came up with a different way of wording things, which in a way, it didn't solve the problem completely. People still felt, you know, this is just 2 words on a document, but it was enough to help them, to make it possible for them to carry on working together. And so this, when I think about that question, is difference subsumed or is it like really there? I think actually it's not really there, but they're really working towards it. It's almost like what they're trying to bring about, even if it's not actually there yet. So with this background of like how important justice issues are to Friends of the Earth internationally, I now would like to come briefly to like the questions that the book addresses and a quick outline of the chapters. So the question, there are basically 2 main questions of the book that like animate the discussions and the analysis of the book. And I wanted, but it actually happened by chance, that the questions I was interested in were questions that were important in anthropological debates, but that also resonated with crucial effects with the activists. And this phrase, resonating with crucial effects, comes from Uni Vicken's work on how does scholarship relate to the people we're working with. And to me, it was really important that my study was something that was both engaging in anthropological debates, but also engaging with the troubles that they were grappling with in Friends of the Earth itself. So I describe the book as a form of activism in itself, and I'll get to that later on. But the 2 questions were, one, how do you take into account difference, and sometimes radical difference, in a context where you've understanding that difference to be in a shared world? And this is important because for Friends of the Earth activists, while they fight to have space for their differences, they also have personal experience of what it's like for one way of life, one understanding of the world, one ontology to actually impact and sometimes attempt to wipe out another one, right? So the experience of the world as interconnected. In fact, I'm really glad there's this photo, because this is the idea of everything is related to everything else, okay? Even though there is radical difference, Friends of the Earth activists from all around the world have experience of this interconnectedness. And that's the first question. And then the second question is about power. How to, again, take into account different types of power within a single narrative without having to shift the sort of explanation that you give to it. So, for example, the convention, the sort of the type of power that is conventionally attributed to humans, like symbolic power or the power of discourses, but also material forces and vulnerabilities. Like I was really interested in trying to explain and work with how you can have power, lose it, shift, find some possibility of being effective here, but then not effective somewhere else. And those are the 2 questions of the book. And the politics side of things is really important, because very often the previous ethnographies or like descriptions of environmentalism and NGOs and civil society movements very often portray these NGOs as being non-political, as trying to provide expertise which was based on knowledge rather than on a political, without recognizing the political processes that they were engaged in themselves. So I couldn't avoid it because Friends of the Earth are all about politics. So there was that. Now, the chapters are all organized in a narrative of what it was like and what it was like for me and for a number of other activists to join a group, then become more experienced and get to know the Federation different ways. So the first chapter after like an introductory chapter, then chapter 2 is the sorts of like dilemmas and philosophical questions and your own like wondering about, okay, there's something in the world that's really upsetting me that I want to do something about, and you're figuring it out, and now, okay, now I've decided I want to join the group. So in this chapter, which I call Proposing an Imaginary, I address these 2 questions that I mentioned, and I develop three conceptual tools, which are force fields, vectors, and in that is direction of attention, and unprotected backs. And basically what these offered me, they offered me a way to be able to pay attention to these different things within the same field of, like without having to shift my attention, that they were things that were happening at the same time, simultaneously. And they're based on what I learned from working with Friends of the Earth, but also they're a synthesis of Haraway, Ingold, and Latour. And something that was like important to me was that I also took on the way of working of Friends of the Earth. So the book, but especially this chapter, like offers proposals. It's not only a matter of like descriptions and analyses, but proposals of how can we imagine the world to be, have and to be emergent from difference, while at the same time having these issues of power differentials and inequalities. So that's, you have your problem and you want to join a group, and then then the question is where, which group? And so chapter 3 is basically a methodological question asking, okay, like where was I doing research? And the simple list is that I did research with Friends of the Earth Malta, with Núcleo Amigos da Terra, and I'm very proud of my t-shirt, which I still wear, with the International Secretariat in Amsterdam, and up to like 8 or 9 international and regional meetings in different parts of the world, but then also daily on email, telephone, messenger. It was, and so you could describe this as a multi-sited fieldwork, but actually I found that the ways that the activists engaged with each other, especially, for example, through ICTs, information communication technologies, they generated different forms of being in place. And it's more multi-topological, right? There are different forms of site making and place making involved. So there's where the fieldwork and the research was happening. Then chapter 3, oh, I don't know where I am. Chapter 4 is how you're introduced to an organization, and this has been consistent, that the activists who are newcomers get given the history of the organization. So chapter 4 explores the understandings of history and time, but also how they're put to work in campaigns. Then once you move from, you've joined your group and you start to work as an activist. And chapter 5 is a study of life histories. And in this chapter, I really wanted to give a sense of what it's like to try and live a life where you're trying to be sustainable. So it's basically, it traces the forms of ethical self-formation. How do you monitor your behavior? How do you make decisions? How does that happen in a collective? Like, so is this, do they feel like they're individuals? Do they feel that they're part of some other form of personhood? Development, and then once activists become more experienced, then typically what happens is then a number of them want to join the international work. And this normally happens by going to your first international meeting. So chapter 6 is a description of the international meetings. In fact, there's a photo there again of the international. This was my second international meeting. And there's a shift. So when members relate to Friends of the Earth International first as this a representative of their national group, there is a shift from when you go to these meetings, and there's a shift from what Tim Ingold calls attributional identity to a sense of relation and belonging. And in this chapter, I describe the rhythms and the multisensorial experiences of how this shift in sense of relationship and belonging to the group happens. And then, once the meetings are over, activists go back home, and many of them carry on engaging with each other through emails, Skype, Zoom now, and they develop very close friendships, but they also carry on working and through these information communication technologies. And what the chapter 7 is about is very much on how actual presence is generated through these online forms of communication. And it actually offers a critique of notions of the virtual, for residualizing, for ignoring the very material and embodied processes that create presence, whether you're this regional form of presence, which is when you're in a geographic space where there's the air that you're working with, and the form of presence that's generated still very materially by the transduction of either voice or light. And it was really a powerful experience of how you will feel present to each other in these different ways. Then chapter 8 is a discussion of how within the Federation there are shifts in power, where groups feel that they can have more effect within the Federation, and when they lose effectiveness, and also how groups like, for example, Friends of the Earth Europe, the regional group, relate to institutions like the European Union. And then finally, chapter 9 is a sort of a bit is a second critical chapter about what is the difference between the use of words and what actually happens. And these are, I took some of the key concepts, which are flatness, decentralization, diversity, inclusion, and facilitation. Say, okay, what actually happens with these words? So that's like a summary of the book. And I think I want to end, because I'm sure I've gone. I want to end by, I should have mentioned this at the very beginning, that I joined Friends of the Earth in 2002, Friends of the Earth Malta, and I was employed to run an applied anthropology project. And then in 2005, when I asked the International Secretariat, can I do my fieldwork at the meetings? They told me yes, but only because, not only because I had this engagement with Friends of the Earth Malta before, but as a representative of Friends of the Earth Malta. And in fact, there were a number of other researchers who wanted to participate in like, for example, the Swaziland meeting that you're seeing the photo of now, and they weren't allowed, right? So I had access because of my participation. And what I like to think, and I'm open to being proven wrong, is that because of my anthropological training, I was able to maintain a critical engagement. And what I hope the book offers is an example of how you can do research with a group that's not only familiar to you and close to you, but that you actually share the vocation with the people you're working with without losing this critical engagement. Obviously, I might be wrong. But so I think just to end, this is how I see the work as the book as an activist project itself, like an anthropological form of activism, is because, first of all, the split between activism and scholarship is sometimes it just doesn't make sense at all, because a lot of the people I worked with were university scholars, like Friends of the Earth Columbia, the key activists in that group were one of the pioneers, like university professors, in developing ideas of, what was the word, food sovereignty and ecological debt. So their activism and their scholarship is just one and the other. And it also the idea that you can separate activism from scholarship also asks questions about how can you consider research to be impartial, and what does that mean, right? So I take the opposite, that I am not impartial, and I have to constantly be criticizing both myself and the work or critiquing the work I do in relation. But I think that anthropologists actually have so much to offer, especially in relation to the way we work, right? This embedded, long-term, engaged work to addressing these crises that we're facing. So I think we should not shy away from working actively, like activists, towards a more just and sustainable world, even if it means we have to take responsibility if we turn out to be wrong, right? So that's me, and I will stop sharing.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And now we turn to our reviewer, so that we can draw out some of these questions in more detail. Go ahead, please, Stewart.
Okay, thanks very much, David, and thank you, Caroline, so much for sharing the photos. Many of them are in the book, and I think they just bring alive so many of the points that you're trying to make. And actually, I think I've got some prepared questions, as you know, for later. But actually, I'm definitely going to ask you one about scholar activism, because I think that's a really interesting one. So that we'll keep that one for later. I'm Stewart Barr, a geographer from the University of Exeter, so a human geographer. So I'm not an anthropologist. And actually, I think that has enabled me to kind of access the book from a slightly different angle. And I think a lot of the comments I'm going to make are about how I appreciate the kind of depth of the anthropological approach that you've taken here, because the kind of topic that you're looking at in the book is very familiar to me and familiar to many human geographers that focus on environment and society. But the methodological approach, whilst ethnography is very familiar to human geographers, the way that you've applied it, of course, is in a much more sustained and deep way than perhaps many human geographers are used to. So I think that's going to form the basis of most of the comments that I want to make. So, as I say, I'm entering into this kind of discussion as a geographer. I found the book initially of interest because I was fortunate to work about 10 years ago on an Arts and Humanities Research Council project on the transition town movement. And the researcher that worked on that, interestingly enough, was an activist himself, and did an ethnography of 3 transition town groups here in Devon, in southwest England. But what he was not able to do, because of the nature of the funding, and I think it's the nature even these days of human geography PhDs, they're getting more and more compressed, is that he wasn't able to have the level of deep engagement that is demonstrated in the book. And I think it was really helpful of you to kind of outline the way that you entered into this process, because that clearly gained you access, for example, to meetings in a way that other people were not able to have that. So I think that kind of deeper engagement is really crucial. So I think there's an awful lot that human geographers can take from this. And certainly, I think it's quite common for geographers to work with anthropologists, but I think this is one area where we can actually create some more connections. One other area of familiarity for geographers, I think, is the theoretical framework that you used. So the idea of ecological phenomenology. And when I was reading the chapter, the kind of first critical theoretical chapter in the book, that was obviously citing the work of Ingold and Latour and Haraway, these are all kind of really familiar to many geographers. So it's quite interesting to see the way that obviously you have applied those ideas working in your context. So again, I think this is something, it's a book that is a really easy one for a geographer to read. The final thing I suppose I want to say as a geographer is it's interesting thinking about the scope of what human geographers do on the environment, in environmental humanities and environmental social science. There tends to be a lot of focus on policy and governance at quite an upscale level. And then the research that I've undertaken in the past has tended to be on behavioural change. So there's been quite a focus on behavioural change at the individual level or the neighbourhood or place-based community level. But geographers haven't generally focused on organisations. And I think that's one of the other key things that's so valuable about this book, is that it is this intense ethnography of, well, of course, it's not just one organisation because it's a federation, but you know, they are linked by Friends of the Earth International. And the key things that I pulled out from that were really the focus on histories and life histories, which I think is really valuable, which I want to return to. Practices, which I think is something that, again, geographers are beginning to write about a lot more within the context, in particular, of this idea of social practice theory. The importance of relationships, and I'd perhaps like us to talk a bit more about kind of relationships outside of the organisation and how kind of people manage their identity with people who are not part of Friends of the Earth when they hold such a strong environmental justice identity themselves. I think that can often be a big tension that emerges. Then, of course, networks, and geographers have written a lot about actor network theory, so that was very familiar. And then what you were talking about in chapters 8 and 9, I thought was really fascinating about power relations and the way that individuals have to navigate the organisation, and how there is a kind of an underlying politics to how the organisation works, which I think exists in most organisations, but you, I think, have brought that out really nicely. So as a geographer, I've got a whole list of things which I'll probably have to be quite brief about that I thought were really key elements. If anybody on the call has not read the book, these would be the things I'd say, this is why you should read the book, because there are very interesting and I think sometimes unique things that emerge. I mean, the first one I've kind of touched on is the intensity of the case studies. But I think the point that you started your talk off with is really crucial, is that the theme is environment, but it's very much grounded in a justice context. And that's really important, because certainly a lot of the work that human geographers do in this space, it is generally focused on climate mitigation, and often the justice component is not heard. So a lot of assumptions are made about the fact that, you know, the research context is the global north. There isn't much consideration of the global south in a lot of the research that's done. So I think by focusing on Friends of the Earth, you allow that justice discourse, and also the tensions, for example, the case you mentioned of FoEI Ecuador, to emerge between the global north and the global south, and how certain activities within the organisation are privileged. Secondly, the structure of the book, and you've given us a great overview of the chapters, but there is, of course, this narrative approach that goes through the whole thing. So we start off, it's very cleverly done, with your kind of entering into the organisation. And then you gradually, as the chapters accumulate, are talking about the different interactions that emerge. So in a sense, I feel that kind of your journey within Friends of the Earth is written into the kind of structure of those chapters. You do say that a couple of times explicitly about the structure, but it is very cleverly woven. So it's a kind of book I feel I want to read cover to cover, kind of in one go, because of that weaving of the narrative. I've kind of touched on the theoretical richness, but there is a lot in here. You do grapple with the kind of ontological and epistemological basis of the work that you're doing, both at the beginning and the end of the book. And actually, most of the chapters also kind of have a reflection at the end, which tries to draw out those themes. So I think you were obviously very mindful when you were writing it about continually linking back to those kind of theoretical propositions that you made at the beginning. You've mentioned mixed methods. You're very upfront about talking about your mixed methodological approach. And again, I think there's a lot of learning that we can gather from the way you've applied those. There's a kind of field of human geography at the minute, which is kind of broadly speaking geographies of everyday life. So what I also enjoyed was, because of the rich description that you have in the book, you're able to draw out the importance of the mundane. And I think that's so critical when we're looking at the everyday life of these kinds of organizations. So there are parts of the book where you've got diagrams of the way the offices are set out and the importance that that has to the kind of functioning of the office and the life politics that goes on with the office. So there's a great deal about human relationships. That's what kind of comes through to, or perhaps more strongly than anything else, is the richness of those human relationships, the tensions which emerge, how those govern the kind of outcomes that the organization has. Final three before I perhaps turn to some questions so that we have time for those. You bring out the tensions between, on the one hand, in the national FoI organizations that you work with, their attentiveness to their history, and that kind of national based history, the uniqueness of their kind of nation specific history, but also an awareness that they need to be dynamic, they need to be responsive, and they need to be connecting to what's going on globally. And I think it was really interesting how different organizations that you worked with, you know, in FOI approach that differently, and how some were at pains to kind of sit you down and say, this is the history, this is how we started as a group, this is really important. Positionality, I won't say any more about that now, we're going to come to that in the questions. And then the final one was a really clear sense of the personal struggle that people had in kind of negotiating their identities as members and volunteers of the groups that you work with. Because, and I think I'll come to this in the questions, but for example, if you're going to an international meeting, do you fly? That's a very carbon intensive activity. And so you were talking, you started off your talk about kind of saying, how do we live a sustainable life when we know that many of the practices we're engaging with are harmful and they're unjust? And that, I think, is a big dilemma that all of us face on the individual level, but clearly came through in the personal struggles that you focused on. Right, so anyways, I've got so much to say, I'm going to miss out 2 pages of notes so we can get to the questions. But I've got 5 things I'd like to ask. Hopefully we'll get through most of them, but I can merge some of them together. And perhaps I will merge the first 2 for the purposes of time, which is about ethics and positionality. I think I'm really aware of the fact that you've worked within an organization and that you kind of have a responsibility towards the people that you worked with. But you also want, as an academic, to portray things in a very transparent and critical way. So I just wondered if you could talk us through how you managed some of the ethical dilemmas about how you talk about people in the book, and perhaps what you found from a positionality perspective, the most challenging part of the field work.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks so much. It's really interesting to hear your take on the book, because it helps me understand better some things about what I learned. So I'm really grateful for that. So the thing about like this, the question of the ethics and how to portray people, first of all, because as I mentioned, in order to do the research, I had to have a certain sort of, they already had to trust me. And when I joined Friends of the Earth Malta, I was interviewed like several times, and I got the sense from those interviews that they were actually just conversations, and they were trying to figure out whether like my views, my values, my way of doing things could like align, that it was safe to have me around. Because and the question of safety is really quite real, right? Because, for example, I was even though I did my fieldwork in Brazil, I was meant to be going to Colombia to work with the Colombian group. But just a few months before I went, the government issued a statement that environmentalists were enemies of the state and they had their offices ransacked, unlawful arrests, and I was advised that it was not actually safe for me to go at that time. So these, like the who joins could actually like impact on the lives of activists around the world. So it really is like it could have an immediate effect, even if it's like a book on a dusty shelf. It might actually make a difference. And so there was a lot of like, okay, who are you? Who am I? And because I joined right away as an anthropologist, because my project was an anthropology project working with these two community centers, I was already both an activist and an anthropologist. So my presence was always the one who was like critiquing and challenging. And it was who I was. I engaged with my friends and my colleagues as a critical person. So in a way, they already knew what I was interested in and how I would engage with these ethical dilemmas. And in a way, that also helped people decide what they would share with me and what they wouldn't. Right. So by a lot of the things that I shared were like, yes, you can tell anybody. Like there was most of it, like 90% of it, there wasn't an ethical dilemma for me because they chose what to share with me and what happened. And then the second sort of bit to that was that when they realized that I was interested in process, like how the meetings worked, what their experience was, and not in the campaign material, then there was also like, oh, there's nothing to hide about this. And so this sort of tells where the concern of ethics comes. It's not on how we work, because they actually wanted to tell the world look, we're really struggling to be really just. But it's rather the content of the discussions, because, for example, if they say we're going to have a protest in this town at this time and somebody finds out about it, then it could be like disbanded or prevented from happening, right? So the content, and that, to be honest, never really interested me, because there's so much already being done on the content of campaigns. And what I felt is missing is this understanding of people as people struggling with their daily lives, right? And I think, so you asked me, like, what was my biggest challenge? It wasn't really a challenge, it was a surprise. Because everywhere I went, I was expected to give a presentation about my theoretical background, the questions of my fieldwork, what methods I was going to use, and basically I was expected to present as if I was presenting to anthropology colleagues. And in fact, one member of the IS had an MA in anthropology, one in Brazil. So they were anthropologists, and some of them trained scholars, right? So this was a surprise, and it led me to think about these contexts as granular publics, right? That's your scholarship is always folded in the ways that you engage with the people that you're working with, right? Who does the anthropologist and scholar become accountable to? Who are the audiences of legitimation, right? And I think the real challenge was actually how my work was taken by certain colleagues in anthropology, that this is so weird. What am I doing? What is this topic? And how are you going to be doing fieldwork in so many different places? I think that was the biggest challenge, because I wanted to respond to what I knew was important with working with Friends of the Earth, but that didn't always quite gel with certain understandings of what anthropology is. So that was the hardest bit.
You're great. No, yeah, fine, thank you. That's a really, and I find what you said about ethics really helpful, because it makes me realize that different kind of disciplines within the humanities and social sciences, they have quite sometimes different approaches to how we deal with ethics. So I think that's really fascinating. Thank you. I'd like to return to one of the points I made about perhaps understanding a bit more about how the people you worked with negotiate some of the challenges of their sustainable lifestyles, if you like. So I've picked on this issue of, say, carbon intense behaviors and flying, simply because there's so much in the book about the importance of belonging and identity and going to international meetings. And I don't know if you can just talk through whether people experience any kind of cognitive dissonance and distress about doing that.
Loads. And it's not only about flying, it's about all sorts of things. And in fact, it's quite, there's a lot of that in the chapter on life histories, where I just give a couple of examples because they're so like helpful to understand. Like, so one of the founders of Friends of the Earth, Malta, told me that the way that she tries to make these decisions is by trying to understand the consequences of actions, following the traces or the links of, if I what depends on what I use, how does that use, how do those actions affect things beyond, and really like this image of this experience of thinking about the world as stretching out like as far as possibly you could imagine, is this understanding of following the consequences. But then she said the really difficult point is knowing when to cut off, like when to say, okay, now I can't feel responsible for everything, because then you come to a standstill and you cannot live. Basically, this is one of the challenges of like, where do you stop feeling responsible? And she said, like, for example, look, I just made you a cup of tea, and to make that tea I used an electric kettle which uses electricity. And so, but am I going to stop making tea? No, I've decided that I still want to drink tea. That's one sort of, it's this and in fact it's not a, from the examples I give is that it's not a I once and for all I've decided, but it's a constant negotiation. Can I carry on making this choice, or now it's really time to switch from tea to water? Or, you know, I mean, it develops, it changes over time. And another activist told me she was looking at her garden, and I said, look at that tree. And there are the number of ants that are burrowing under this tree might actually be threatening the tree. What do I do? Do I let the ants destroy my tree, or do I protect the tree? Right? There's this juggling and trying to figure out. It's an ethical dilemma for her. And she said that how she figures it out is she o che o minha coscienza pode aguentar. And my Portuguese is so rusty, but what my conscience can put up with, you know, what can my sense of my conscience, what can I put up with? And so my question was, okay, so like how do you develop this conscience? Like, and a lot of the activists will be, a lot of the work that they do is reading. They read documents, they watch films, they go to conferences, and so this process of learning about what are those consequences, how important is it for me to take care of this tree rather than use sprays to kill the ants. And another activist who was very close to me, she showed me a film about how Coca-Cola factory workers are treated in South America. And I had to stop drinking Coke, because that feeling of my conscience, so that every time I drink Coke, it affects the direct possible life or death of these people in factories. So this is that sense of, okay, as I learned more about these chains of consequences, I changed my behavior. But then when I stopped engaging deeply with Friends of the Earth, and like that memory of that film faded, I found myself finding it okay to buy a Coke every now and then. So it's really like, if you carry on engaging with activists, and especially at the international level, where there's so much exchange of what's happening, right, of and seeing and getting to hear these stories from people who have experienced it, that's how like that conscience is grown. But the thing about flying is that there wasn't that much flying. It's once every 2 years, and the ones who were flying the most were like Tony Juniper, who was the head of Friends of the Earth, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And I think many people criticized him, and he found his own ways of like justifying to himself why it was okay to fly all the time. But mostly this is why they depend on communication technologies, because they want to be engaged all the time without flying. But
yeah, right, thank you. I'm going to hope David's okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we'll probably go to Right.
Am I taking too long?
No, no, I think there's so much to say, isn't there? My last question then, before we have the break and then the Q&A, is I'd love to hear more about the kind of the relationships that the activists, volunteers, employees had in their kind of everyday lives outside of the organization, because I just wondered how much their social networks were very tightly related to FoI, or whether actually they had these broader social networks, and whether that was challenging because the people they may be kind of interacting with in their other social networks were not as engaged, and whether that was a frustration for them. So, yeah.
So this really varies a lot. And one thing that was like, actually, I might have overemphasized this in the book, that this sense of being in Friends of the Earth or not in, let's say, in Friends of the Earth Malta. Yes, you were part of Friends of the Earth, but you were also part of a much wider environmentalist movement. So you had, let's say, one of my closest friends, who's been friends for many years, he was not only a member of Friends of the Earth Malta, but also part of the astronomy group, part of the Bird Trust. He went to all sorts of activities and conferences which were related to environmental and social questions, but not as a member of Friends of the Earth. So in a way, like the way that people navigated like social relations was very much of like finding relations of affinity in a way, right? In many different places. And the experience of, for example, family members was the hardest part, where I'll tell you a story of my own, because this is the one I have. A friend of my mother, we were having lunch together with my mother and the family, and she turned to my mother and said, "Oh, don't worry, darling, this is a phase, it will pass, and we'll forgive her. We'll forgive her the condescension, because actually, as an adult still living with my parents, maybe she was right." But the point was that there was this sense that you're always having to justify your beliefs, and a lot of people end up with burnout. And in fact, oh, what a lovely dog, David, is that yours?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's wonderful. We'd love to see. But a lot of activists end up with burnout, because it is really about constantly struggling against people who don't take it seriously in your personal life, in the activist life. And I'd like to mention Hannah Fitchett, right, who's doing I mentioned her PhD research with Extinction Rebellion, and one of the topics is this burnout. So yeah, I think I've answered your question.
Yeah, but just to respond, because the project we did on transition towns in Devon, burnout, exactly that phrase was used time and time again by some of the people who were helping to, in the core group, who were helping to run it. And the other thing that was so this idea of networks of affinity, I think when we traced their kind of life history back, they were people who were, they were in CND, they were members of the Green Party, they were the kind of at the forefront of recycling when it started. And then the transition town movement was the next logical step. But actually they retained that wider network of affinity, so that you would tend to see the same people in these place-based communities being involved, but always feeling that they were kind of on their own and they were driving this, and that was very frustrating. So I'm just affirming really what you were observing.
Can I add one more thing? Because you reminded me by mentioning the transition towns. Actually, this shift happened also at a federation level, where the activists, after like decades of, for example, trying to have campaigns at the United Nations, realized that like this was just literally like bumping against a brick wall. And the shift had started happening in around 2007, but now it's established that rather than addressing like this frontal campaign, they're focusing more on supporting community shifts and changes. So I mean, I don't think that they're working with that many transition towns, because around the world it's very much a UK thing, transition towns, which I want to know a lot more about. But this shift happened, like it happened on federation level. I'm working more closely with Via Campesina and Movimento Sem Terra, right? So these, who are you going to engage with, even in your campaigns? You know, are we going to carry on doing this, or find places to actually do stuff? Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Right. Thanks. I probably should hand back to David at that point. So over to you. Thanks. Thanks very much, Caroline. That was great.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating discussion. Yes, please do fire in your questions into the Q&A box. We'll take a short break now, and we'll see you again at 5:10. There we are. So, see you then. Well, so good afternoon, everybody. Really, there was a great deal of food for thought. I mean, if I could just sort of abuse my position to ask a really rather an important question, I think, which is this question of exhaustion, because these movements are absolutely vital to all of our futures. So is there a middle way, in as much as can people somehow get the balance in such a way that their activism is sustainable? I can completely see the problem, because in effect they will be feeling themselves marginalized and oppositionalized throughout. So I can definitely see that. But of course there are multiple forms of ecological activism, and I also completely see the dilemma that slow activism, it were, may be too late. I mean, there's that fear, and when you get that fear and you wish to speed up, then you get into oppositional behavior, and when you get into oppositional behavior you feel marginalized. So anyway, whether you think there is any remedy to this dilemma, I should be fascinated to hear from both of our speakers whether they think there is a solution. Thank you.
No, it's a really good question, and the first thing I think is that many of them don't get burnout. That's one thing. So good. in Friends of the Earth Brazil, you have the women who founded the first group in the 60s are still part of the, well, not all of them anymore, unfortunately, but they're still activists way into their 90s, which is amazing. But I'll give you an example of something that, like, what happened to me. So I worked with Friends of the Earth like intensely for 9 years, and I got a bit of burnout, and I said, like, I have to change projects now, I have to do something else. But it didn't stop me being interested in how to live this sustainable and just way of life, right? And what I shifted to was working with a community gardening project. And I left my academic, I stopped trying to apply for academic jobs, and I went to learn how to be a gardener because I wanted to learn how to grow my own food. And obviously anthropology never stops, right? So it became another anthropology project. But it's this shift of, like, for example, Stewart, like the transition towns that you're talking about, and working with people who are building these ways of life. It's never perfect, you're always struggling, but it's not that protest or that campaign. It's about actually feeding myself and my kids, like learning how to make clothes detergent from hazelnut shells, which I don't think works yet. But you know, you're trying different things, and that's definitely possible. I mean, it's definitely possible. Using trains, I want to now find a way to find a way to get back to Malta with a sailing boat, but that's a little bit expensive.
Yeah, I've just also a reflection of I would agree that I don't think the interest ever goes. We're running a project at another AHRC project at the minute with creative practitioners and about eco-anxiety, and one of them last week said, actually, I've just had to step back. But they're stepping back not because they're not interested, but because they simply need to take time, re-energize, participate in things that perhaps are not going to take as much of their time, as much hard work, but they're no less committed. So it's kind of like breathing in and breathing out. There's a rhythm to it of entering in and stepping back that happens, I think. So even the people that expressed to me 10 years ago that they were feeling burnout in the transition town movement are still very much involved, but there's a rhythm to it, I think, that they recognize that they need to take time out, I think. Yeah, and I think that explains partly why they call it the Salvation Army.
It's because in armies, they know exactly how far you can push a soldier before they will have a breakdown. And so they put them on the front line. After every 2 weeks, they bring them back from the front line. And they can, therefore, they're able to sustain the struggle more, which will bring us to a question about which of these groups have the most successful organizational structure, which can lead to better sustainability. But let me not insist on asking that now, but perhaps just because we have other questions here in the chat. The first one's not a question; it's from Tito. So says thank you for the presentation. Well, thank you very much. That's always nice to hear. Now, Matthew Wingfield would like to ask a question. And Matthew, if you would like to ask your question live, all you need to do is to put your hand up, and so that we can see you as a participant, and then Haneen can spotlight you. Otherwise, we will ask your question from the chat, just in case you can't, in this case, it's not convenient for you to speak at the moment. But we'll wait for a moment in case you'd like to put your hand up. Okay. So in that case, we'll ask this question for him. So Matthew Wingfield asks, working on international groups such as this, do you find that contextual specificities were managed effectively in engagements, or perhaps some nuances were lost in engagements due to the international and collaborative nature of the organization? So that's really the contrast between the local and the transnational. Indeed, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, because Matthew said that you joined late, so I'm not sure which bit you came in, but actually the struggle to make sure that the specificities are not lost is what I described about this challenge to create like equitable space for the differences of the groups in the international way of understanding what Friends of the Earth is and does. But if it's about the relationship between the local and the global, then that's a really tricky question, which is debated all the time, or was when I was there, right? So one of the stories I tell in the book is this idea of like, okay, how do you, if we want these practices to be very much like grassroots, so you want to work with local communities and you want to do work on the ground, but then if you have things happening coming from other parts of the world, and for example, the acid rain was one of the examples that was really clear, or any forms of pollution that travel, now climate change is obvious, right? And then some sort of engagement with whether it's governments or international fora is necessary, because to ignore that means that anyway you end up with the stuff dumped in your locality, right? And this is why, for a very long time, Friends of the Earth International focused on international bodies like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and other of these like transnational bodies. But they found that it didn't make any difference. There are such incredibly powerful interests driving what happens on that governmental and like these transnational decision-making contexts, that it's a pragmatic choice about where do we have more effect.
Well, thank you very much. Did you want to add anything, Stuart, to that point?
No, that's fine on that one. Thank you. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. And now there's a very simple question from well, when I say simple, I don't mean a simplistic question. I just mean a very short question from Inez Miranda, who says, is any group stationed in Portugal that is a member of Friends of the Earth? If so, how can I connect with them in the work that they're doing?
I looked them up, Inez, if you want to chat, and there isn't. So maybe you want to set one up.
Well, there we are. That's a very equally straightforward answer. I think you're welcome to contact our speaker, and perhaps she can advise you how to do that. Now, Catherine Whittle, would you like to ask your question live? If so, then.
David, you're muted right now. We can't hear you, David.
Oh, so we'll go to Catherine Whittle's question now, please. Oh, so Catherine, your hand was up.
You were accidentally muted for a little bit, for at least one sentence or so.
Oh,
So,
I'm sorry. Catherine, do put your hand up and then we can take your question live. You just need to put your hand up again.
yeah, Catherine, if you want to speak, put your hand up. If we don't see that, we'll just read out your question. There's also another hand up, David.
Yep. So I see Jim Wade's
wonderful.
one. So it's nice to see you, Jim. So not up at the moment. In that case, we'll read it. We'll read it out. Catherine says that she is a PhD student writing her thesis on Extinction Rebellion in Southeast England, and much of what Caroline has shared resonates. My question is about whether tensions between timescales and temporalities showed up in Caroline's fieldwork. For example, did the sense of urgency around climate breakdown influence activists' processes or reflection on strategies? Was the conflict between needing change now and the timescales for making change noted? If so, how was it reflected upon or responded to?
Yeah, it's a really, it's a great question. Thank you. And also, Catherine, I if you want, we can get you in touch with Hannah so that you can talk about your similar interests. So yes, absolutely. In fact, the original approach that Friends of the Earth activists took for many years was we have to act now. And it's so important to act now that we're actually going to postpone any other sorts of conversations to never or to another time. And this is what led to Friends of the Earth Ecuador leaving in 2002. And because of how it shocked the Federation that they could be so like aiming to have this fairness within the Federation, and then something. So basically what happened with FoEI was that the Netherlands groups were working on developing ideas of corporate social responsibility and environmental responsibility. Like they were developing these ideas of how can we engage with corporations and get them to take responsibility for what the effects of their actions. And the same corporations that they were having conversations with in the Netherlands were, of course, they had their factories and activities in Ecuador. And what happened was that when the Ecuadorian laborers and workers and activists were claiming and asking for better conditions, working conditions, they were told, like, aren't you Friends of the Earth? Friends of the Earth Netherlands are much more reasonable. Why are you behaving in this oppositional way? I thought, like, you're ridiculous, right? And it's completely set back their campaigns for really badly. So when the activists realized that the effect of how they work differently impinges on each other, they said, okay, action really needs to be put on the second burner to creating solidarity, to creating a place where lives are lived fairly and fruitfully. So this has now become the character of Friends of the Earth International, right? That yes, of course, action now, but what sort of action, right? These transition towns that Stewart, you were talking about, these community projects, it's about action now, but really like making life livable for people who are, for example, losing access to agricultural land or losing access to seeds, right, or plants. This is the sort of now action, and the campaigns are happening on an international level, but they're the amount of energy and attention is more given to making lives better. I hope that, yeah.
Yes, and I was just going to add that certainly our experience of some of the transition town groups, and I think in other groups I've experienced as well, just in my everyday work, there is that tension that often exists between some activists who just want to be very radical now, and others, for example, who, you know, may, for example, they may be retired civil servants or local government workers, and they have a different understanding of the political landscape. They want to take more time to work within the system. So, and these are the tensions that often, I think, you know, occur during meetings when people are trying to decide through consensus decision making, which is one of the later chapters in your book, of course, talks about that decision making process. That is something that really emerges. So I think it's something that goes through a lot of these organizations. And yeah, so I think, Catherine, you're right, that kind of temporal element is really important. And just to say, if you're also interested, one of my colleagues, Kerry Burton, who's an academic here at Exeter Geography, she did her PhD about 15 years ago on climate action protests, and embedded herself with climate action groups. So it might also be worth looking up her thesis as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And now we will go to Jim Wade, please.
Yeah, Jim, you should be able to unmute yourself now to speak.
I think I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me,
Yes.
David?
Absolutely. Right. Go ahead, please. How nice of you to join us.
I hope David will allow me to explain why I asked the question after I've asked the question.
Yep.
The question is, in working, doing your ethnography, if you like, for your book, Caroline, it was a period in which academia, and I can include the RAI as part of academia in the wider sense, scholarship, academia, intellectual life, has been deeply penetrated by political correctness, stroke woke culture, stroke cancel culture, call it what you will. To what extent has the Friends of the Earth and other similar organizations been saturated, shall I say, because I'm being rather aggressive about this, by woke culture? I ask as someone who very consciously withdrew my financial support from Friends of the Earth about 10 or 12 years ago, and I would explain why. Both you and Stewart used the word justice a great deal during your exposition and review, but it seemed to me entirely anthropocentric justice. I've been a sort of anthropologist for, I think, 63 years now, since I graduated from UCL, and I never thought being anthropocentric was a necessary concomitant to being an anthropologist. And the only mention of other species during the conversation up to now was the tree and the ants. I think justice, the ontology of justice, is it justice with respect only to our own species, or is it justice to other species? Which is why I have moved my support, for what it's worth, from outfits like the Friends of the Earth to rewilding, to even my own garden, making it a wilder garden. We are the ark being the mantra in this. I think you understand my position, and I would love you to give some thought to it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I think that's like, these are the sort of conversations we need to be having. So I'm really grateful that you raised it. So on the one hand, so for example, Friends of the Earth have been involved in a broader movement to set up something called the Rights of Mother Nature. And this is sort of like a petition to the United Nations to include the rights of ecosystems, of animals, of like broader ecological systems in that understanding of rights. So to shift from human rights to ecological rights. And I think that maybe from the conversation, it didn't come across, this work didn't come across so much, because possibly my attention slipped, right? And I didn't talk about the stories which included the idea of that justice is environmental justice. So actually, it's a shift from saying, no, we're not going to be just paying attention to nature protection, where, for example, so many nature reserves, and Brazil, this is extremely widespread problem in Brazil, where nature reserves end up displacing indigenous peoples who have actually contributed to how that, let's say, the Atlantic rainforest is what it is. So what Friends of the Earth does is try to bring humans back into the relationship, that they're not separate from nature. And I think I wanted to focus on that so strongly, because when I was doing my research, a lot of the research being done in anthropology about environmentalism was on nature conservation groups, and being very critical of them because of the impact on human groups. So that contextualizes it a little bit. But then and I'm really happy that you're growing your garden, right? We all do things differently in order to achieve what we believe in, this struggle that we have to how to live sustainably. But I think when you brought up this question of woke, and Jim, I will quote somebody else. I know I can't remember who. Yes, it was Priyamada Gopal, who writes. She's based at Oxford, and she's a historian writing about colonization, coloniality, and decolonization of the university. And she said that if somebody calls it woke, then they're not woke. So what this means is that all these debates about fairness and justice and how words and the way we refer to people have actual effects on what they are enabled to do in the world are not just political correctness. They're ways of shifting how we attend and care for each other. So what Friends of the Earth does is that they include the interconnections with the non-human, or sometimes it's not even the non-human, because the people involved don't necessarily even make that division, right? This is their community, and their community includes the soils and the animals. But I really didn't focus on that a lot in the book, so you're really right to point it out.
Yeah, and just I won't add much, Jim, but actually some of the notes I wasn't able to talk to you because I took too long on my other notes. I do actually, my last bullet point before I got to the questions was how the book attends to the diverse relations between humans and non-humans, and actually it was something that came through very strongly to me. So apologies for not highlighting that, but anyway, that's just from the reviewer's perspective.
Well, thank you very much. Does that answer your question, Jim?
Oh, indeed it does. Thank you very much, both of you.
Well, it is very nice to hear from you again. Thank you very much for joining us. The wonder of these marvelous seminars, so that we can contact people who wouldn't normally be able to come to London. Delighted. And that, I think, exhausts the questions that people have actually posed to us so far. So I can turn to
David, if I may, there is
is there one there?
Anonymous, there's an
Did we not take the anonymous one? Ah, no, of course. There we are. So let's go to the anonymous one. I'm so sorry. So Anonymous writes, thank you very much for your point, that they've been thinking about burnout and how that burnout might be connected to a number of variables. And they say that they were doing a fieldwork project in an occupied forest in Germany, in Hambach. Burnout was a big issue there. And after some time there, I felt I could understand why. The fight against the mining corporation that was felling the old growth forest seemed to be a fight that cannot be won for a number of reasons. From the grief at seeing the destruction, to the threat of police embarking at any time, lack of feelings of safety due to feeling that the police are monitoring the camps, hard conditions such as no water sources in the vicinity, water was something they had to struggle to get, and a variety of micropolitics that made burnout a thing that many people struggle with or ended up in. That's a kind of a comment with a specific empirical example. What do you think?
So I think I'd like to give like a personal story. So the reason why I felt I had to stop working with Friends of the Earth and do something different was I had reached a point where my anxiety was, I was having nightmares about having our children taken away from us and ghettoization, and it had reached levels where I needed medication basically and help from therapists, because this anxiety had reached a point where you can't move, right? It's happening now and you can't move. And I think that we just need to take that really seriously. And there are, I was at a conference in Finland, a fantastic conference in Finland that was like in March, where a person was giving a talk about how some groups are now trying to develop, and actually Extinction Rebellion as well, are trying to develop ways of collectively dealing with these forms of grief, and how by inventing rituals and collective practices on how to express that grief, and it helps realize that this is not just something internalized and individualized, this is being shared. But I wonder, Stewart, because you mentioned that you're doing a project right now about climate anxiety.
Yes, that's right. And I think we're doing a couple of projects with this, one with creative professionals, and that project's really about enabling them to articulate their climate anxiety, as you say, as a group of practitioners who usually practice individually. So it's bringing them together, and then to think through the ways that they can manage that as a collective, and then find positive ways to engage people with kind of climate action in the future. The other one that I think is really interesting, that's gained a lot of coverage in the UK, is reported eco-anxiety amongst young people. And that's where I think we rub up against this challenge that is very often expressed at an individual level. And there don't currently exist many mechanisms for people to share that collectively in the way that you've been describing in a group context. And so another project, another AHRC project that I'm involved with is working with a creative agency in one of the wildlife trusts in England, to bring 10 young people together who want to take climate action but have been individually experiencing climate anxiety, not to coach them through a process, but simply to facilitate them through a process. Because I think one of the problems, certainly in the UK, is that kind of anxiety expressed as a mental health concern is often dealt with on an individual level, say through therapy, but the group dynamic doesn't exist in the way that it might do with an environmental organization. So I think one thing that is beginning to happen is that more group therapy sessions are occurring in order to enable people to perhaps appreciate that it's not only their individual anxiety, but it's something that's shared. So but I do think certainly the high level reports suggest that amongst young people, eco-anxiety is a particular problem. And I probably know less about it at the moment in environmental organizations, but I mean, certainly in the UK, we live in quite a neoliberal context where most things are individualized. And so if you are experiencing some stress or anxiety, say related to the environment, the supposed solution is to individually go to the therapist. And I think those approaches that you've described within groups probably will be very constructive to deal with that. Yeah.
I have to add, Stuart, that actually the therapy is something that really did help. Good. So yeah. I don't want to sort of like say one or the other, right? That absolutely without the collectivity, then it does become a neoliberal, put the responsibility on the individual, right? But also not to shy away from what is available, right? No, absolutely. And I think in my experience, I think the kind of individual therapy is often the first step. In having that conversation, and then it may move beyond that, but I think that's, as you say, where most people would go initially.
Yeah. Which is really one of the questions I was going to ask. I mean, it's the question of organization, because organizations really should be able to sustain the people who are part of them, and that's the point of having an organization. And I work with religious organizations, but an organization of human beings is, of course, cross-compatible. And the absolutely fascinating thing about religious organizations that work is there isn't only one kind of organization which actually sustains them. There are different kinds. And so there is one kind that I know of that's been extremely successful, where they've actually done their very best to take out the stress. And what they say is this: they say, it is our aim to be successful, not only in our own country, but globally. But the success will come as the last step. Until we get to that final step, it's absolutely fine to participate in wider society. It's fine to conform, to go to take your children to school, to do what you need to do, to dress similarly to other people, but at the same time work with everybody else so that we get to our ultimate goal. And that means that they can maintain their organizational structure at the same time as the individuals within that group actually being sufficiently materially successful to not feel overstressed about the fact as to when they're going to be successful. So that's their model. Other ones, another one might, and that one is you see, I should say, is but by making each other aware discreetly who's in that group, then they support each other. and those who have gone through their particular system earlier act as mentors for the ones that are just coming in. So I'm not saying that it's in any way dispersed, but that's one way they get around the stress and the necessary and in fact the loss of their numbers, which come through confrontation. Because if you act as a confrontation, you lose some people on the way. And then there's another one which I work with, which emphasizes more the importance of small face-to-face meetings. And an expectation that their understanding is more profound than the outside world. But the way that they have to, the only way that they can sustain it there is to have designated leaders who carry on with the teachings periodically, enough to keep them in the loop, as it were, and rituals which reinforce the sense of being slightly different. And so they work most effectively when they can actually have face-to-face meetings together. It's that kind of one. But you notice it's different from the other one, which doesn't require face-to-face meetings. And then, of course, there are ones that are explicitly confrontational, and there are other ones that have said, we'll do it through the political system. We'll simply create a political party, and eventually we'll get enough people. And when we've got enough people, we can use the state's assets to make sure that we carry on getting larger. But the way that we're going to persuade people is, however, to work very, very hard on our organization. And so it's a tough and strict political organization, which is successful because it helps the people with the material things, but nevertheless, we're all going to get our goal through political power. Anyway, that's just a few, and then the other ones that work. So the question is whether any of these kind of different models that you can get from anthropology are applicable to any of these movements, and whether some of these movements, accordingly, are more successful in maintaining their followers than others.
For sure. In fact, because Friends of the Earth is a federation, like, it's really interesting to hear about the different strategies, right, and the different groups. And I have a question for you, actually, David, before I go on and before I lose it. Like, how much overlap is there between these different organizations that you've just mentioned? Like, do people participate in different groups at the same time, or are they very different people? Because I think we mentioned earlier this idea of affinity. You have lots of different groups of affinity, where networks of affinity, I think you said, where like, so first of all, this idea of the solidarity and the support, I found it mostly is that the attention is dedicated to it on Friends of the Earth International. Then the member groups, and there were 73, I didn't work with 73 groups, I worked with 2, right? So it's of those 2 national member groups, there was very different ways of dealing with how do you support the group. And one of the, in Brazil, there like a big sort of point of tension was that there was different understandings of what it means to support people. So like what is a good leader was a big debate at the time I was there. So one sort of group, it wasn't even a faction, it was like 1 or 2 people, thought that having a good leader was somebody who could decide and offer strong direction, right? And that was because they felt that would be supporting them. It was a genuinely felt need that having a strong leader would tell them what to do was good. And then other groups who, the other part of the group is saying, no, leadership is a form of facilitation, eliciting what people want to do and helping them do it themselves. And so even this idea of what it means to support and how do you turn that into an organizational shape, it's contested like everywhere. But the thing about face-to-face meetings, and this is part of something that I found that when we talk about face-to-face, and Tim and Joe Bergunst have written a really wonderful article, a chapter in a book critiquing this idea of face-to-face, because a lot of the presence and creating of relations is not so much about like facing each other, but the things that you do together. And their chapter is about walking together. And I found that a lot of the friendships were developed through email and messages, and then every now and then going on camping trips, for example, or meeting up at campaigns. But this idea of how do you create a sense of close relations happened in many, many ways. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I'm mortified, but I have to go to my next engagement. I've got an official engagement tonight. This is absolutely fascinating. This is far more important than having to show my face at an official engagement. I'm terribly sorry. So, many apologies, and I look forward to another occasion to sustain this. And I hope you have a pleasant discussion for the remainder of the seminar. So good
But I
evening
think
to everybody.
we might have come to the end. Stuart, what do you think? There aren't any more questions?
Yeah. Thanks, David. No, I don't think there are. I've just checked the chat, oh, sorry, the Q&A, and I don't think there are. So, yes, this might be probably an appropriate. Oh, Jim's got his hand up again.
Yeah, okay, let's see if Jim wants to make a last comment or question. Jim, you should be able to unmute yourself. Jim, you can press the button that's at the bottom left corner of the screen.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I may have at the same time, if we clicked at the same time, I may have muted you accidentally. Now.
Can you hear me now? I do beg your pardon.
Yes.
Okay, it's a bit of a follow-up from the previous one. Now, Caroline, in your with your long experience with Friends of the Earth, have you found over the last 20 years that there are certain questions, particularly, you know, the global north vis-a-vis the global south, as they call them these days, that are simply basically taboo? Basically, you really cannot politely ask the question. And the question, of course, the elephant in the room, as so many people say, is population, population growth, social justice, overpopulation, habitat destruction, etc., etc., etc. Have you found this? And is this a leitmotif in your book at all?
So no, it's not a leitmotif, but I relate some stories about it. So, for example, the question of population is very openly discussed, and you have some activists, like I know, in their own personal lives, have even had operations in order to not be able to have kids. So because they believe that so strongly that it's a population issue. On the other hand, because this is a federation which has groups from Africa and the Indian subcontinent and South America, there is a very clear argument that, have you ever seen those graphics about the climate change, who is responsible around the world?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah.
Right, so the 10%.
Almost every day.
Yeah, but the 10% most responsible are people from Europe and the United States and China and the other parts of the world, which are considered developed and industrialized, right? Whereas the majority of the rest of the world who live in different, it's really like 10%, and the rest of the world have minuscule effects on these climate gases and emissions, right? So the argument there is very much questioning, is this yet another form of trying to control different cultural ways of understanding who is allowed to have children and how? It's a form of reproductive politics. And they have these discussions a lot. But there was one sort of taboo, which I find problematic, which we discussed amongst us, right? Which is, for example, if somebody goes and works with Shell or another oil company, I don't want to give them advert space, but if you go and work with an oil company, then you become a taboo person very often. So like there was one case of a person who worked with ERA, the Nigerian group, and it was really quite shocking that somebody who would go from trying to protect local communities who are affected in serious ways by the oil companies, then goes and gets a job. But from speaking to people who are like in labor movements, right, this idea that a worker is responsible for the corporation that they're part of is ridiculous. They're all people who are struggling with similar struggles, and actually the responsibility has to be those who are making the profits. So this was a sort of quite a strange taboo, that if you then go and join an oil company, you're an outcast. And I don't know if that's changed. But at the time, when I was doing my fieldwork, that was a sort of a taboo.
I don't want to sound sort of self-righteous with the question, because looking back, I can see that in a sense that taboo applied to myself. I worked for 49 years and lived for 49 years in Nigeria, in northeastern Nigeria. I was teaching art history, mainly African art history, to Nigerian students, actually in Maiduguri, Boko Haram country. And some of my own students, I mean, I think the record, one of my students had 30 children. One of my closest friends had 16 children at the last count about 10 years ago. And I never took them aside and said, you know, you're potentially ruining the earth for, you know, not only for the rest of it, for your own grandchildren. It just wasn't something that I felt was appropriate. Can I add one last point, because you have discussed the notion of affinity at the moment. I'm wondering to what extent individuals, at least in places like Britain, and I don't live in Britain, I live in Hungary, actually, but people in Britain who might have joined organizations 10 or 20 years ago are now actually doing local community things through their council or just their neighbors, in terms of, you know, the curve along the road no longer being a lawn, but being wildflowers, making certain nests are not destroyed, etc., etc., just working as individuals, all with friends and neighbors, which of course wouldn't come under the purview of, you know, affinities in organizations. And thank you for giving me so much time.
Oh, thank you. Stewart, do you want to answer? I mean, I have something tiny, but maybe you want to answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Jim. I think, I mean, there's been a general trend since the 1970s away from kind of, I think, formally joining kind of activist organizations in a country like the UK. But I have noticed, yes, that there is this growth that we've talked about a little bit with place-based communities, transition town initiatives, but even at the smaller scale, so the neighborhood scale, particularly trying to protect and promote biodiversity. So several contentious areas would be campaign groups on streets developing to protect wildflowers on verges, and a lot of protests from against local authorities who come along with a big mower and I mean, there was an example in Plymouth in southwest England about 2 months ago where the city council cut down a large number of trees in the city centre at night with security guards everywhere, and there's been a huge groundswell of community-based protest. People have come together to protest against that. There's now a campaign group in that area. Even on my road, anecdotally, people have come together and said, we've told the local authority we no longer want them to use weed killer on the road. There's just a group of us who will come along and weed the verges. We're happy to do that. So I think your instinct there is right, Jim. Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to add is that there's a book by Chris Hahn and Elizabeth Dunn, I believe, from 1996 about civil society, right? Where some of the critiques about understandings of activism and civil society is that these forms of organization are not considered, whereas actually they might not have formal organizational structures, but they're still forms of social movement and organized activity, right? And it's just that wasn't the focus of my book, but it's still organized activity.
Yes, if you're not getting other questions come up, I mean, I can make a footnote from here in Hungary, which is not a country particularly notable for its, you know, big deal conservation sort of movements. But you know, when a small bird, you know, hit one of our windows and was injured, it wasn't difficult to phone a girl slightly south of the capital who looked after the injured birds and got them well. That wasn't difficult. We have a man only a few kilometers away from here who looks after storks, because it is part of Europe where there are a lot of storks. He devotes his life to this. He has actually an injured male stork that cannot leave his garden, his area, but the female migrates to Africa or wherever during part of the year and returns to her quote-unquote husband every year in his garden. Now, neither of these people, as far as I know, are members of any organization, but I think they are typical of millions of people, perhaps older people in these cases, because I think people of my generation in England at least remember a time when there were about 32 million hedgehogs in England, where they're in Britain, where there are now less than 1 million. And I think there are a lot of people who are not, not engaged in organizational efforts, but are highly conscious of this sort of thing, and perhaps are making their own small efforts. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, thanks, Jim. Yeah, really interesting. Yes, I think just a final comment from me. I think you see that a lot. There's one thing that some of you on the call who are in the UK know. There's a kind of annual bird watch survey that goes on at the start of the calendar year. And that's just grown and grown in popularity. And that's just people counting wild birds because they're so concerned that the populations are dropping. So I think there's a lot of engagement there. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, so it looks like we're coming to the end, and there's been some really good questions and comments. So thanks to everybody who has come today to the event. Is there anything you would like to say?
Tito raised his hand.
Oh, is there a new raised hand? That is very okay. Let's see if Tito has something to fit into the last minutes. Tito, would you like to speak? You need to unmute yourself first, but you can now. There's a button in the left lower corner for muting and unmuting Tito. So I can't do that for you, unfortunately. You will have to, I just allowed you to unmute. I've also clicked on ask you to unmute, so you may have a prompt right in the middle of your screen. Oh, that's a shame. Do you have something you maybe want to write in the Q&A? I don't see anything coming in. But there's definitely also a way to be in touch with our speakers. So anybody who has sort of leftover questions can email me and I will forward anything. So I'm going to put my email in the chat for everybody. So if there's anything, anything that's been put in the chat and in the Q&A, I will share with our speakers anyway. So if there's any sort of leftover comment that they may not have seen, or any thank yous you want to put in or have put in, that will be passed on. And it looks like we're not able to get Tito on to speak, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry about that. I'm not sure what's happening on the other end. All right. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to thank Caroline and Stewart for being here with us today and giving us so much inspiring things to think about. And so I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, both of you, and also everybody else that is still with us right now. So thank you. And I'm going to close the event now.
Thank you so much.